So in the perfect world, we'd be fully authentic and sovereign beings making informed dispositions, but there's a problem: identity investments. So there's something we do behind our own backs that we don't notice and which reduces us into puppets. And it's investing our identity in certain complexes of ideas, certain worldviews, certain perceptomes, certain ideologies. And when you look across the world, you can really see how it is divided into certain groups living in different realities, realities that they are often quite unwilling to release themselves from. And there's a good reason for that. And that is that we invest our identity into these worldviews, which means that we cannot easily let them go without feeling that we let ourselves go. And this is interesting and important because it is what makes us so easily manipulated. And it is also what turns us into these kind of helpless avatars, which are really just tools or puppets on the strings of particular sets of ideas. An identity investment is when we wed ourselves to particular ideas. You could call them the hills that we will die on, not because they're true, but because they scaffold our identity. We use these ideas, so to speak, to know ourselves, to feel ourselves, to feel that we exist, to feel that we are someone with this set of opinions and not this set of opinions, with this worldview as opposed to this worldview. So Gabor Mate has a really interesting point about the internal struggle we all carry, an internal war essentially between conformity and authenticity, an internal battle between our desire to be ourselves fully and our desire to shave off aspects of our personality or our views in order to fit in. And so this struggle, this battle between authenticity and conformity is an existential one that takes place, I would argue, in all of us pretty much at all times. But if we're unaware of it, we might let the wrong side win. And the problem is that if we shave off too many sides of ourselves in the name of conformity, in the name of fitting in, it actually is a kind of suicide that we're performing on ourselves. A suicide that we perform because we're afraid to stand by ourselves, based in our fear of standing alone against the majority. And this is especially difficult if you don't have a strong enough identity to withstand the pressure of the majority. But there's a paradox here, right? Because we have this intuitive feeling that we stand strongest together, which is really not necessarily the case, right? Because it really makes us weaker when we sell our souls to certain ideas or certain perceptomes or worldviews in order to merely fit in. In so doing, we reduce ourselves to something less human and more puppet-like. And so one of the consequences of wedding ourselves to our worldview, which is to say, believing in it so deeply and using it to structure our identity in such a deep way that we basically relinquish our ability to hold said worldview out in a stretched arm and evaluate it objectively. This is how you get an entire population to fight amongst themselves while they don't notice the powers that they really should be fighting are not amongst themselves, but manifest themselves in some very different places in society. It is the selling of our souls at the expense of our authenticity and our identity. And so how do we know if we ourselves are suffering from this malady? Well, some indications might be if we're deeply provoked by certain worldviews or points, if we refuse to interact with people who don't share our worldview, if we refuse to change our position based on evidence, or if the idea of steel-manning our opponent's position feels somehow repulsive to us, then we can be pretty sure that we have wedded ourselves to our standpoint, that we are not free agents, that we essentially have invested our identity into our perception, into our worldview, into our particular position on whatever topic it might be. And so one very powerful test to see if we are indeed cognitively free, liberated agents able to shift views and play with different opinions, different worldviews, or whether we have wedded ourselves to our worldview is to ask ourselves, am I willing to steelman my opponent's worldview? And if we're not, the problem isn't out there, the problem is inside ourselves, obviously. And if this is the case, we know that we've been captured by something external to ourselves, a mind virus, we might call it. A question we might ask ourselves is, where do my, say, political convictions come from? Did I develop them myself? Have I arrived at them by logically concluding myself through the landscape of opinions and views and premises? Or have I indeed been taught to think like this? Have I been indoctrinated? Have I been influenced by some external forces to see the world in the particular way in which I see the world? And if so, am I willing and ready to play with my view? Or am I essentially stultified or fossilized in a particular worldview? We can ask ourselves, were my ideas planted in my mind by my parents, by my leaders, by certain corporations trying to make money off of me, by cultural premises? Or do I get a feeling of insecurity, a feeling of losing myself at the mere idea of loosening the grip of some of my most deeply held beliefs? So let us ask ourselves, in which ways have I allowed myself to become a tool of external forces, basically using me as a tool for their goals or objectives? And so strategies to get out of this rigid, captured state in which we allow our invested identity to determine our opinions rather than evidence and logically coherent arguments. One powerful question we can ask ourselves is, am I truly ready to let go of any opinion if presented with powerful evidence or logically coherent arguments? We can ask ourselves, am I ready to steelman my opponent's position? And if the answer to these questions are no, well, we know there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. Another way of loosening our grip around these ideas that have captured us is by asking ourselves, where do my strongest opinions come from? Like, really? How did they end up in my mind? Have I arrived at them at my own cognitive capacity, or am I essentially being used as a tool by external forces more powerful than myself? And the interesting thing about saving ourselves from becoming essentially enslaved by our own opinions, scaffolding our identity, is really to address this black hole of insecurity that we all carry inside us. And I would argue that it's deeply related to the fact that we feel in a way we don't exist, or we have a sneaky suspicion that we somehow don't truly or fully exist. And so we latch on to particular worldviews and opinions, and we use them to feel and experience ourselves. And in order to stop doing that, we have to acknowledge that there is this hole inside us, this deep and profound insecurity that we somehow don't quite exist. And once we address this hole, and once we can sit with it without feeling a need that we have to fill it with some opinion or whatever, we can actually start to instead cultivate an actual true identity within ourselves, right? We get to ask ourselves, who do I really want to be? Do I want to be that stultified or fossilized, basically an opinion with legs? Or am I an investigative and curious person going through this life, looking at different ideas, weighing them up against each other, and being able to see the power and merit of ideas that are maybe contradictory to each other, that might be in political sense, right? Can I actually see the good points from the right and the good points from the left at the same time and hold this tension? Now, once we do this, we start inevitably, I would say, to develop a different kind of identity, one which is not scaffolded by certain or particular ideas that we live and die by, but instead by a curiosity and an open field of our hearts, basically, that are ready and willing to play with ideas, to hold contradictory ideas, and which gets a certain weird pleasure from holding up contradictory ideas without having to come down on one side or the other, essentially becoming a human being instead of a puppet or a receptacle for a certain ideology. And now this can be hard, right? Because The trick is that because we're using our adherence to certain ideas or ideologies, the idea of letting go of them, right? Because we're using them to scaffold our own identity, it essentially means that letting go or loosening our grip around them will feel like we kind of disappear a little bit, right? Because we were using it to know ourselves. And now if we're letting go of that, how can we know ourselves? And this will generate a certain feeling of insecurity about who we are, whether even we exist, and we have to be ready to face this insecurity, and we have to know that this insecurity is basically the door into curiosity. And once we do that, chances are that we will be able to walk through life without constantly feeling that we have to come down on one side or the other. And once we're free enough to do that, well then,